An in-flight fire on board an aircraft is just about one of the most horrifying scenarios in aviation. To be a passenger in such a scenario is to be helpless due to the lack of options being locked inside a metal tube. While investigations into some of these events can uncover why in-flight fires occur in the first place, in other events it cannot be fully determined on the exact source of the fire. Such was the case in the event of Air Canada Flight 797. A DC-9 carrying 46 passengers and crew between Dallas and Toronto caught fire halfway through its flight. The flight crew did manage to land their plane, but with extreme difficulty. The captain was facing exhaustion. The plane's interior exploded less than 90 seconds after landing, killing 23 people. The Inferno started in the aft lavatory, and while the place of origin is known, why a fire started here was never fully understood. But what were the series of events which occurred on this flight, and what are some of the more prevailing theories as for the start of the fire on Air Canada Flight 797? As discussed in a previous video, the DC-9 was one of the most popular planes amongst airlines of its time, especially in North America. Canadian flag carrier Air Canada operated over 60 planes of the type across multiple variants. The DC-930 was the most popular variant of the plane for many airlines, including Air Canada, with its stretched fuselage and increased capacity. On June 2, 1983, the DC-9 registered as Charlie Foxtrot Tango Lima uniform would make its final flight between Dallas-Fort Worth and Montreal via Toronto. The plane left Dallas at 4:25 p.m. and began making its way northeast towards Canada. To avoid seasonal bumpy weather over the US South, the plane made some deviations for a more comfortable flight. At the flight controls on this flight was 51-year-old Captain Donald Cameron and 34-year-old First Officer Claude Ouimet. Both pilots, by the time of the incident, had thousands of hours already logged in the DC-9, and both pilots had been flying for Air Canada for over 10 years, Captain Cameron being hired back in 1966. In the cabin were 41 passengers and 3 flight attendants, for a total of 46 people on board. Being halfway through the flight, the DC-9 had been cruising over Kentucky at 33,000 feet. The pilots had been served an in-flight meal during this time. The plane has been in the air for nearly 1.5 hours by this point. It was now 10 to 7 in the evening Eastern Time, when the first of a series of peculiar events begins to occur. At 6:51 p.m., 3 circuit breakers relating to the aft lavatory trip on the flight deck. More specifically, the 3 circuit breakers are for the toilet flush motor, which itself is powered by a 3-phase alternating current motor. Each phase has its own circuit breaker. All 3 had failed. It is unclear on whether anyone was in the lavatory at this time. Captain Cameron noticed the popped circuit breakers and immediately tried to reset them. The flight crew did not make much of it at the time, and according to the revised accident report, took no further action. Air Canada at the time had a policy that allowed pilots to try resetting the circuit breakers multiple times. 9 minutes later, at 7 p.m. at the rear of the cabin, a passenger seated in the last row began to sense a strange odor in the air. They swiftly turned to Flight Attendant Judy Davidson, working at the rear of the plane, for information. Davidson traced the odor to the aft lavatory. Before she opened the door, she first acquired a fire extinguisher. In this case, it was a carbon dioxide fire extinguisher. With fire extinguisher in hand, Flight Attendant Judy Davidson peeked into the aft lavatory to discover that a light grey smoke had filled the inside. She herself noted inhaling some of this smoke. She did not notice any flames at this time. Over the next few minutes, the situation would quickly worsen. The chief flight attendant, Sergio Benetti, then takes a look for himself inside the aft lavatory. This time, the inside surfaces of the lavatory were sprayed with the fire extinguisher. Benetti also did not observe flames at this time. The third member of the cabin crew, Laura Kayama, was then instructed to start moving passengers to the front end of the cabin and to start opening the air ventilation above the passenger seating. Sergio Benetti then returned to the aft lavatory to get a better look inside. This time, he observed darker smoke pouring out from the seams behind the vanity and ceiling. At 7:02 p.m., The flight crew were notified of a potential fire in the aft lavatory. With this information, the captain donned his oxygen mask while the first officer left the flight deck to inspect the lavatory for himself. As he left the flight deck, he did not take the available portable oxygen or smoke goggles. The first officer would not make it to the aft end of the cabin, as over the last couple of minutes at this point, it had now become significantly overcome with noxious smoke enveloping the 3 to 4 rows of seating at the back of the cabin. There was a brief conversation between the first officer and the chief flight attendant, who had mentioned that they could not see the source of the smoke and that they also believed that the smoke was not emanating from the trash disposal container. At 7:04, the first officer returned to the flight deck to suggest to the captain, and quote, "They go down." First Officer Ouimet wanted to get a look inside of the aft lavatory himself, and so the captain handed him the smoke goggles. At this time, the cabin crew believed the smoke to be easing. Passengers had now all been moved to the front of the cabin. At the time, the philosophy in aviation when faced with an in-flight fire encouraged the pilots to initially fight the fire before landing if necessary. As such, it took several minutes for the captain to take the action of deciding to land the plane. The time was now 7:06 p.m., and the captain has not yet made the decision to land the plane as he expected the fire to be put out. First Officer Ouimet then proceeded to the aft end of the cabin again now that the smoke had eased somewhat. He had the intention of entering the aft lavatory, but decided against it after discovering that the lavatory door itself was significantly hot to the touch. He decided to leave the door shut and instructs the flight attendants to not open the door. Another flight attendant signaled from the other end of the cabin to return to the cockpit. While the first officer had been out of the flight deck, Captain Donald Cameron noticed that multiple electrical malfunctions had occurred on the flight deck. A master caution warning indicated that the left side AC and DC electrical systems had ceased functioning. The captain called air traffic control in Indianapolis to notify them of an electrical problem. No mention to ATC about a fire on board at this time. With the loss of some electrical systems, some crucial aircraft instruments had failed, including the attitude direction indicator, which functions as an artificial horizon on the pilot's primary flight displays. A controller stationed in Louisville, Kentucky had noted that Flight 797's radar beacon had been lost. The fire on board this Air Canada flight was beginning to eat its way through the plane's electrical systems. Once the first officer returned to the flight deck, emergency power was switched on. The emergency power on the DC-9 is stored in an auxiliary battery which provides power to the aircraft systems, bringing Captain Cameron's instruments back to life. A mayday was transmitted to the ground at 7:08, and descent from 33,000 feet was initiated at 7:09, 17 minutes after the initial popping of the washroom circuit breakers on the flight deck. Air traffic control suggests that Flight 797 diverts to Cincinnati Airport, 25 miles away from the aircraft's current position. The flight crew accepted the suggestion and requested clearance. The plane's transponder was switched to setting 7700, despite the fact that the fire had already caused the transponder system to malfunction. The transponder is a piece of aviation equipment which relays aircraft information to air traffic control. Information such as altitude, airspeed, and heading can be useful for controllers to know in tracking an aircraft. By punching in certain codes on the transponder, different emergencies or failures can be communicated. Code 7700 is the General Emergency Transponder Code. Because of interference of this system from an in-flight fire, certain information on Flight 797 is not getting through to controllers, including the altitude information. They could not see on their radar that the plane was descending, and the 7700 emergency squawk code could not be relayed. Controllers in Louisville began to vector the plane to Cincinnati Airport. They would then also contact the airport by telephone moments later to inform them of the incoming emergency aircraft and its position south of the airport at 20 miles out. Air Canada Flight 797 had begun their rapid emergency descent, descending at a speed of around 310 knots. To help the plane descend, the speed brakes were deployed, disrupting airflow over the wing. Preparations were now underway at Cincinnati for an emergency landing on runway 36. The airport fire department had also been advised and began making their own preparations. It was not until 10 minutes past 7 that Flight 797 reported to the controllers at Cincinnati about a fire in the aft lavatory. The following is an ATC recording of the conversations between Flight 797 and the ground. Note that you can hear in the timbre of the captain's voice that he was speaking through his oxygen mask.
Air Canada 797 Cincinnati approach, altimeter 3003, ident, plan runway 36 ILS, the wind to Cincinnati 220 at 4, and we are VFR. Can you make it to the airport?
Air Canada 797, that's affirmative.
Roger, plan runway 36 ILS, and the equipment has been alerted. Do you have time to give me the nature of the emergency?
We have a fire in the back washroom, and we're filling up with smoke right now.
I understand, sir, and say type of airplane, number of people on board, and amount of fuel.
Okay, we'll copy that later. I don't have time now.
2 minutes later, at 7:12 p.m., the flight crew of Flight 797 requests some meteorological information, specifically asking for the cloud information. This was likely for the flight crew to gauge an idea of when they could possibly get a visual hold of the airport from the plane, as it was an overcast day. Light rainfall was also reported by the control tower. By this time, the plane is only 12 miles out from the airport, but the plane is still too high and too fast. Now at an altitude of 8,000 feet, the captain decides to circle the airport and land in from the east on runway 27 left instead. The onboard fire continued to burn its way through critical aircraft systems. The pilot's heading indicator had failed, as indicated by the fact that the flight crew struggled to report a heading at the controller's request.
Are you heading 090 Air Canada 797?
Okay, we check. We don't have any headings anymore. All we have is a small horizon.
Air Canada 797, say it again.
We have no heading. We have no instrument. All we have is an horizon right now.
Can you give me a heading, Air Canada 797?
Stand by, we'll try.
Air Canada 797, if able, turn left.
Air Canada 797, turning left.
ATC clears Flight 797 for a landing on runway 27 left, and by 7:15, the plane was vectored out away from the airport with enough distance for them to safely turn and line up with the runway visually. Over the next few minutes, the smoke in the plane would begin to fill the cabin from the rear of the fuselage, and even enter the cockpit. Interesting to note that during the unfolding crisis, the flight deck door was left opened. Before landing, the captain requests that the first officer depressurizes the cabin using the air controls on the overhead panel. Smoke was continuously pouring into the cabin and cockpit to the point where it was getting unbearable. The first officer then took drastic action and opened the window on his side to try and clear the smoke. Such an action was now possible at a lower altitude and a slower speed. The effect of this was negligible, as the outside noise was also unbearable, and so the window was immediately shut. The first officer would open and close the window several times in the final moments of the flight. Through the thick smoke, Captain Cameron was able to spot the airport and successfully touch down on the runway a few minutes later at a speed of 140 knots. One of the systems which the fire had disabled during the flight was the anti-skid system. Applying maximum braking power and full reverse thrust to slow the plane, 4 of the landing gear tires of the main undercarriage burst. The plane came to a halt just short of taxiway Juliet and runway 27 left. Immediately after this, the captain began the engine shutdown checklist. The flight attendants, all now stationed at the front of the plane, also immediately began the cabin evacuation. The 2 front doors were opened and the slides were deployed. Some passengers, along with the flight attendants, were able to escape through these doors. No flames were ever visible up till this point by anyone on board the plane. 3 of the 4 overwing exits were also opened. Captain Cameron and First Officer Ouimet attempted to escape the flight deck by going through into the cabin, but were unable to because of the heat and smoke. The first officer was able to escape through the window on his side. The captain, however, was facing exhaustion, having flown the plane by himself by hand, while also being overcome with smoke. He was now drifting in and out of consciousness. He was able to open the window. Firefighters on the ground then sprayed the captain along with the inside of the cockpit with foam until the captain was able to escape through the cockpit window. All 5 of the crew members on Air Canada Flight 797 survived the incident. However, just 18 of the 41 passengers managed to escape the burning plane. During the evacuation, and less than 90 seconds since the plane touched down, the interior of the cabin exploded, killing the remaining 23 passengers. Several passengers who did not make it were later found in the aisle, overcome with smoke. Some were either still seated or caught in between the passenger seating. 2 passengers were even found towards the rear of the cabin. Among those who perished in the disaster was Canadian folk musician and songwriter Stan Rogers. The shocking nature of this aviation incident would lead to the obvious question as to why the fire started. While it was obvious that the fire had originated in the aft lavatory, the reason as to why would never be uncovered. One theory suggested that the fire could have started because of a cigarette that had been improperly disposed of in the trash container. The United States National Transportation Safety Board, who investigated the incident, concluded that the trash container was not the source of the fire. They, however, could not rule out that a lit cigarette could have fallen behind the bin and caused the fire to start there. The initial tripping of the flushing motor circuit breakers was also ruled to be an unlikely source of the fire. There was speculation that a generator feeder cable could have shorted. The evidence supporting this was non-existent, but the NTSB could not disprove otherwise. In the end, the source of the fire could not be determined and remains unknown to this day. The investigation looked closely at the flight crew's actions during the unfolding crisis. They found that because of the delay to descend, the opportunity to land at Louisville Airport was missed, which could have saved around 3 to 5 minutes. Air Canada Flight 797 became a watershed moment in aviation safety. New requirements came into force that required all lavatories to come fitted with smoke detectors. Lighting on the cabin floor was also fitted to provide a clear path out of the aircraft in the event of a smoke-filled cabin. New firefighting training was introduced for flight attendants, and it now became mandatory for aircraft manufacturers to provide evacuation procedures of their aircrafts and proof of such in under 90 seconds. In-flight fires continued to claim lives throughout the years for a variety of different reasons. In 1987, a South African Airways Boeing 747 suffered a devastating cargo fire leading to the deaths of 159 people. In 1998, Swissair Flight 111 crashed off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada, because of an electrical fire in the aircraft's wiring, leading to the deaths of a further 229 people. To help fight fires on board aircraft, the use of a certain type of fire extinguisher is recommended by aviation authorities, the halon gas fire extinguisher. Often contained inside a green container, or at the very least labeled green, halon fire extinguishers for a long time have been considered to be the most effective agent for suppressing a fire on board an aircraft. Usage of this fire extinguisher outside of aviation is very limited and in many countries is outright banned due to its nature of directly attacking oxygen. The Federal Aviation Administration continues to recommend the use of halon gas on aircraft for its effectiveness in close and tight spaces. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. If you found this video interesting, be sure to subscribe as there are new videos every Saturday. I have just come back from a week off and have many videos lined up to get back into. If you would like to get your name featured or read out at the end of the next video, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from £3 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. It is that time of the week again where I must once again thank my patrons for their continued support. Thank you to my £5 tier patrons, Aidan Montgomery, Hector Palmatellas, Ian Tatum, Jacopo, KTP123, Ken Zachman, Christy, Leon St. Jennings, Marie Ennis, MG, Pacman7, Panic Chicken, Saria Melody, and So FP. And special thanks to my generous £10 tier patrons, Daniel Hendricks, D. Rogers, a very interesting name choice here, Flaming Hot Cheetos Make My Butt Hurt, Mike Milton, Side Effect, Robert Hamilton, Roger Mayer, Where Are My Cheetos, and Will Tanner. Thank you all so much. And that is it from me this week. Have a great weekend, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.